Good afternoon and welcome back to Virtual Video Shows. I'm your host, Michael Albrecht. Good to be with you again. We met yesterday on Monday, December 28th. Brandon was kind enough to have me give you another presentation. Yesterday, we went on a tour of the Maine coastline, and today we're going to take a tour through history through the U.S. and Russian space race from the 1940s to the present day. Again, I'm your host, Michael Albrecht. I'm a travel photographer, amateur historian, astronomer based out of Austin, Texas. And welcome to you all at Luther Crest Senior Living in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I was just looking at your weather earlier. Looks like you're having kind of a mild winter so far. Temperatures up in the 30s and 40s with not a lot of snow yet. So it sounds like some is coming this week though. So I hope you all batten down the hatches and stay warm. And hope you had a good Christmas. And coming up on the end of the year here in a couple days, New Year's Eve and New Year's Day on Friday, January 1, 2021. Can you imagine that? So we're going to move along here and this tour of the universe series with me, Michael Albrecht. And we're going to be looking again today at the U.S. Russian space race, which evolves from competition to cooperation as time moved on from the 1940s and World War II and into the present era. So the motivation for human beings to travel into space can be partially summed up, at least, in the old Latin phrase, per aspera ad astra, through hardship to the stars. Human beings have always looked to the skies, the night skies, and the stars, and the planets, and the moon, and wondered about our place in the cosmos. So it's been a very natural progression to try to get off the Earth and get out into space, and especially to look back and see where we are. In the early going, in the 1800s, modern rocketry was being developed by a number of key individuals. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in Russia, Hermann Olbers in Germany, and Robert Goddard in the U.S. There were other rocket scientists around the world, a prominent one in France, but these scientists all exchanged information as they went about developing multi-stage rocket systems, refined the types of fuels, solid and liquid fuels that they used, guidance and gyroscopic dynamic systems, aerodynamics. And so it's very exciting time for rocketry. Of course, the Chinese had fireworks and rockets of sorts a couple thousand years ago, but that didn't develop into what we know today as modern rocketry. So the U.S. government was very interested in aeronautics and rockets early on. Here we see the establishment and the first board of directors of the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, NACA, which later evolved into what we know today as NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And here we see their headquarters in Washington, D.C. Russia, likewise, consolidated its own space program, which was spread around several of the Soviet republics, primarily Kazakhstan. And then the late 1980s, they developed the headquarters in Moscow, the Roscosmos State Space Corporation. So both of the superpowers have been hard at it for a number of decades. And the ultimate prize, of course, in the 60s was to put a man on the moon. And of course, with the backing of John Kennedy and especially LBJ, the U.S. was able to achieve that goal ahead of the Russians in July of 1969. And we did that in no small part with a little help from our friends from Germany, the rocket scientists who had actually been developing their rocket systems under the Nazi regime of Hitler. And Werner von Braun, of course, was one of the primary rocket scientists in Germany, along with Hermann Olberth and a number of other rocket scientists that you will meet here shortly. What was interesting toward the end of World War II is that the Americans and the Russians and the British went into Germany and tried to retrieve and extract not only the actual German rocket scientists, but also their blueprints and plans and any equipment they could get a hold of to try to understand why the Germans were so successful with the V2 rocket program. V2 standing for the Vengeance Weapon. There's the name in German, and that is the program that Werner von Braun and Hermann Olberth spearheaded. Those rockets, of course, were launched primarily toward England, southern England, London, and caused a tremendous amount of damage during the war. These V2 rockets had multi-stage components to them, guidance systems, fuel, and were very successful and very accurate, as we know. And as we'll see, they helped the Americans with our Saturn rocket program. In May of 1945, we see Winston Churchill here waving V for victory, VE Day in Europe. And as a result of that, again, the Allied forces extracted various scientists and brought them back to either America, England, and Russia. At the Potsdam, Germany agreement, here we see this famous photograph that I'm sure many of you recognize. Here's Winston Churchill and FDR and Joseph Stalin. They met in Potsdam to hammer out an agreement about how post-war Europe would look. And unfortunately, that agreement and the accords that came out of that left a lot of uncertainty and tension between the various Allied partners. And this led to the Cold War and helped fuel the space race. So here we are now shifting out to Fort Bliss, Texas, which is out near El Paso. And we see Werner von Braun here with his hand in his pocket, and scattered throughout this group of scientists and engineers are a number of German rocket scientists, along with American engineers and scientists as well. And they were all out there developing basically a prototype next generation of the V2 rocket. So it's pretty amazing to think that the German, actually Nazi rocket program was brought over in part to America and used to build our own space program in the 1940s and into the 50s and 60s. Fort Bliss there out near El Paso, and they set up their launch site up at White Sands, New Mexico. And here we see this new version of the V2 rocket now on American soil. And one of those was launched with a camera on it, and it looked back at the Earth. And this grainy black and white photo is considered to be the first photo taken of Earth from suborbital flight. Hermann Olberth and Werner von Braun were transferred from Fort Bliss over to Huntsville, Alabama, to the Army ballistic missile range there in the mid-50s. And again, here we see Hermann Olberth, who spearheaded the German rocket program during the World War. There is Werner von Braun and an assortment of other American engineers and officials. Harry Truman was president late in the 40s, and as these German rocket scientists were coming over, it was considered to be a public relations difficulty, shall we say, that it didn't set well with some people that were bringing former Nazi scientists over here to work on our American space program. So Harry Truman was generally left in the dark as far as intelligence goes, and he didn't have to account for the fact that we're bringing over Nazi rocket scientists to lead the American program. Meanwhile, the Russians had their own space program going. Here's General Vasily Vostok, and in 1946, and he was the head of their program along with Sergei Korolev, who had an interesting history in the 1930s under Stalin. Korolev, who was a rocket scientist and engineer himself, he was arrested by the Stalin regime and jailed in Siberia for treason. But then Stalin realized that Korolev was a brilliant rocket designer, so he brought him out of imprisonment and placed him at the head of the Russian space program. One of the Germans that the Russians brought in was Helmut Grotrup, and he helped them with their program so much that by 1957, the Germans beat the Americans into orbit, into space, with the launch of Sputnik. I'm sure many of you remember this. You were probably in your, 20s, 30s, 40s, maybe. Different ages, but I'm sure this was major news for you. There's the New York Times from the day afterward. Soviet fires Earth satellite into space. And here's a really neat black and white photo taken at the Texas State Fair in Dallas in October of 1957. This is a ham radio, and these people are all listening to that telltale sign of Sputnik going overhead in orbit, which some of you, I'm sure, remember that sound, beep, 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 which was pretty much all the electronic signal that was coming from Sputnik, but we were able to pick it up here in Dallas. Russia had great success going, but they also had some setbacks, significant setback here with the what's known as the Nedelin rocket disaster in October of 1960. They were testing a rocket with liquid fuel, and the fuel exploded, killed nearly 200 technicians, engineers, and leading rocket scientists. So this set the Soviet program back significantly. But nonetheless, a year later, they were able to again beat the Americans into orbit, sending Yuri Gagarin into orbit in April of '61. There's the Huntsville, Alabama Times with the bad news for NASA and the Americans. But we would go on to greater glory. The Russians also launched the first female into orbit in June of 1963, Valentina Tereshkova, who had a successful suborbital launch, actually, and she later went on to become a local politician in one of the Soviet republics. The Russians were using the Vostok rocket, which is actually still in use today. So it was an excellent design. The American astronauts have been launched on this to the International Space Station here in the last decade, while our manned space program was out of commission. Another German that came to the United States after World War II was Dr. Kurt Debus. He was the first director of Space Center at Cape Canaveral. And here we see Dr. Debus right there with John Kennedy as the at the inauguration of the Space Center there at Cape Canaveral. pretty amazing, the mix of cultures and technologies. And I suppose you could say to the victor goes the spoils. And we certainly benefited from the German rocket program. The Russians were able to launch the first human who walked in space in March of 1965, Alexei Leonov. A couple months later, we caught up with them with Space Walk by Ed White, who went into orbit. He was a human satellite, essentially. Can you imagine traveling along at about 17,000 miles an hour, about 200 miles above the surface of the Earth, and you're floating in space, tethered to your module that your comrades are in, your fellow astronauts, I should say. NASA had its share of rocket failures also. Those of you with access and familiarity with the internet and Google, which is hopefully most of you, you could go to Google or YouTube and just type in NASA rocket failures, and you would see a whole series of different video clips from that era. So here we see Werner von Braun, who is now director of the Marshall Space Flight Center outside of Huntsville, Alabama, with another German scientist, Werner Dahm, who stayed with NASA for many decades. So again, we see this merging of cultures and technology at NASA. So by the late 1950s, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the original Mercury astronauts, the 7 astronauts: John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Alan Shepard, Gordon Cooper. Hopefully all of you have seen the movie The Right Stuff, which is a great movie documenting the whole era of the U.S. space program from the 1940s, 50s into the 60s. The Right Stuff, a very good movie, highly recommended. Before we actually launched human beings, we sent up a chimpanzee named Ham. Maybe you've heard of Ham. He went on to stay in a zoo for some years after his suborbital flight. Alan Shepard was the first American up in a rocket in May of '61. And here he is on Freedom 7. The little module is right up top there. So he's lying on his back and being launched on top of this rocket and going up into a suborbital flight. Alan Shepard. Gus Grissom was next, July '61. And then, of course, John Glenn in February of '62 was the first American to orbit Earth several times and splash down in the ocean. John Glenn, of course, went on to become a senator from Ohio for many years. John Kennedy in May of '62 spoke before Congress and said, "We need to go to the moon." And this was before his more famous speech the following year. And in the background here of Kennedy, you see LBJ, who was instrumental in much of the U.S. space program, and Sam Rayburn, who is the Speaker of the House. So you have 2 Texans and the senator from Massachusetts there speaking to Congress. There was a second group of U.S. astronauts that came in, many familiar faces, September '62. And here's Kennedy at Rice University in Houston giving his famous speech, "We will go to the moon by the end of the decade, not because it is easy, but because it is hard." So there's John Kennedy in September of '63, tragically 2 months later, assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Here's LBJ listening to Kennedy speak. So a lot of history wrapped up in all of these activities to get to the moon. Gus Grissom and John Young, the first dual Gemini launch in March of 1965. Here's LBJ at the Houston Space Center with Gemini 4 astronauts. Again, LBJ is a senator from Texas, was instrumental in getting the U.S. space program launched. Ultimately, they renamed the Space Center in Houston, of course, the LBJ Space Center. Here we are in the heyday, the 60s and 70s of Cape Canaveral, all these launch pads, including pad 39A, where they did most of the major launches. But look at all of this. It's really amazing. Here we are on the Atlantic coast of Florida. And it's very symbolic here when you think about it. Human beings, after a couple of million years of evolution on Earth, going from fire and inventing the wheel, all those difficult years. And only finally in the last 150 or so years do we have electricity and indoor plumbing and so on. And within a few decades, we're already launching ourselves off of our home planet out to the moon and the other planets out there, our spacecraft and robots. So it's just amazing. This is very symbolic photo to me, human endeavor into outer space. Here's a wonderful old vintage photo of Werner von Braun at Kennedy Space Center. And actually in Huntsville, Huntsville, Alabama. And there he's watching the test of the Saturn V rocket, which was designed based on the V2 rocket. And now they're testing it and successfully and getting ready to take us to the moon later in the decade, in the 60s. Very dramatic photo there. I love that one. The U.S. Program had its own tragedies, of course. I'm sure many of you remember the fire aboard Apollo 1 in January of 1967, which killed astronauts Ed White, Gus Grissom, and Roger Chaffee. A great loss to the program and a setback. But we forged ahead, signing an outer space treaty with a number of other countries in January of 67. In fact, on the same day, if you'll notice, January 27 of 67, and coincidentally on that same day, we were signing an international space treaty, which was basically stipulating that space was open for everyone. We should all work together, be transparent about our operations, kind of similar to what the treaty that was signed for Antarctica for scientific research. And so it was an idealistic effort, which largely has been followed thus far and modified, as you'll see. The Russians had another setback in their program when Vladimir Komarov crashed. His parachute failed to deploy, and he crashed on the steppes of Kazakhstan. Great loss to that country. Apollo 8 in December of 1968. We're moving along here in the race to the moon. We launched 3 astronauts who went out to the moon, just circled around. It was kind of a dry run, basically, to make sure all the systems were working well. They went up on a Saturn V rocket, again, designed primarily by Herman Oberth and Werner von Braun and the American engineers and rocket designers. Here's a diagram showing their general path, launching here from Cape Canaveral and circling the Earth once and then using it as a slingshot to go over to the moon. It's a 3-day trip to get to the moon. They went around the moon once and then slingshotted back, splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, and were picked up by the U.S. Navy. So that was Apollo 8 in December of 1968. Here's their famous photo that they took coming around the moon, looking back at Earth on Christmas Eve of 1968. Maybe some of you were watching this and were aware of it. This is the famous sighting when the astronauts read from the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without, space was without form, however that was phrased, excuse me. And it was a very moving moment for humanity to see our own planet for the first time out in space. 6 months later, NASA launches Apollo 11 from Cape Canaveral, of course, on a Saturn V rocket. Again, the astronauts are laying on their backs up at the top here in the command module. Below the command module, you've got all the lunar lander and equipment that they're going to use to get to and from the spacecraft down to the surface of the moon and off again. That crew, of course, was Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin, the crew of the Apollo 11. And let's take a brief moment here to watch a short video montage of the Apollo 11 mission. Hope you enjoy this. Can you imagine how heavy that rocket was and how much thrust was required to get that thing off the ground and into orbit? Amazing. Walter Cronkite. And there you go. If that doesn't make you proud to be an American and a human being, to have lived through the age when human beings first stepped off our planet, what a privileged time your generation, our generations have lived in. Very, very exciting. Here's a photo of the moon showing the circles designating the 6 landing sites on the subsequent missions from 1969 to 1972. 6 landings, 2 astronauts each, 12 Americans landed on the moon. Magnificent. There's Buzz Aldrin, July 20, 1969. In his visor, you can see the reflection of Neil Armstrong taking the photo. Footprints in the on the lunar dust. Can you imagine walking around on the moon? In subsequent missions, of course, they drove a little moon buggy around. They hit a golf ball on the surface that probably went into orbit around the moon because of its low gravity. Subsequent missions, Apollo 15 in July and August of 1971. Looking back at Earth again, keeping in mind that Earth is traveling in orbit around the sun at about 67,000 miles an hour. And the moon, of course, is in Earth's gravitational field. So both the moon and the Earth are moving along at 67,000 miles an hour around the sun. The sun, in turn, interestingly, is moving around the center of the Milky Way galaxy at nearly 500,000 miles an hour. So there's tremendous speeds involved with all this, but we don't hardly notice because we're moving at the same speed as them. And that is in part general relativity. Apollo 17, the last mission to the moon, December of 1972, driving the buggy on the moon, which still sits up there. Whoever is next to get back to the moon may find some of this equipment scattered about, sitting there in virtually untouched condition. The Chinese are mounting a pretty significant effort to get to the moon, the Russians too. So another space race is on, so to speak, to get back to the moon and then use it as a base to get out to Mars. So a lot still to be written. Apollo 17 took this wonderful picture, December 1972, of Earth. They left a plaque on the moon signed by Richard Nixon and the astronauts. The Soviets, meanwhile, were continuing their program. They had another setback in June of 1971 when these three cosmonauts were killed when the pressure released inside their module as they were descending back to Earth from orbit. That was totally unexpected and a shock to the country. The cosmonaut crew was expanding through the 1970s as the Soviets brought in other military pilots and engineers. The U.S., meanwhile, launched Space Lab in May of '73, and that project lasted for about a half a year or so, conducting scientific experiments and testing the environment of space, taking photographs of Earth. It's interesting to note how thin the atmosphere of the Earth is, the bulk of the atmosphere. Look at that. You can see that thin blue line enveloping Earth. It's about 50 miles of atmosphere is the bulk of the atmosphere around Earth. It's almost like a membrane around an egg. And it also gives us an appreciation for trying to take care of that atmosphere and not pump too much of our garbage and junk and chemicals and toxins into it because it is all the air we have, and we don't want to foul our nest, as it were. So toward that end, we're moving away from fossil fuels toward cleaner renewable energy, which have their own costs as well to the environment. So there has been no perfect energy source thus far. Later then in the 70s, July of '75, the Apollo Soyuz test project, these sets of astronauts from Russia and America, these famous astronauts, Deke Slayton, who went on to be the administrator of NASA for a while, Vance Brand, I believe Jim Stafford here, and a couple of Russian cosmonauts. I think one of them is Leonid Alexei. And so really an illustrious crew there. And they met in space and shook hands, backing up here a little bit. So really, it must have been quite a reunion, so to speak, up in space when these two spacecraft joined up there, traveling along at about 17,000 miles an hour, about 200 miles above the surface of the Earth, looking down on their respective countries and trying to communicate with each other through their respective languages. So the age of cooperation had begun, and that included the U.S. Space Shuttle program, which ran from 1981 to 2011, launching in April of 81 aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia. In 83, NASA finally launched the first female in space, 20 years after the Soviets had done that. Sally Ride here was the first American woman in space. Space Shuttle Discovery with a U.S. Russian crew in February of 1994.
Booster ignition and liftoff of Discovery on a bold new era of spaceflight between the United States and Russia.
Magnificent. Conducting all kind of scientific experiments and observing Earth. That's really wonderful. It's great to see us all cooperating. It'd be nice if the politicians and would cooperate as much, and we'd all get along a lot better. But science has always been at the forefront of international cooperation and competition as well. It's true. The Russians in February of '86 launched their Mir space station. Let's watch a little clip of that.
Astronaut, cosmonaut Norm Staggert is making his first ride into space. We're having no trouble working together. The language has come along fine, and at this point, I wouldn't say that's a big barrier. I think we can do it. Indeed, given the cost of these projects these days, I think that's what we will do in the future, both for a space station and probably further exploration of the moon and looking at the planets.
So fantastic. There we see the U.S. Russian cooperation in space continuing well into the 90s. Here's another view of the Mir space station orbiting Earth. You can see all of the solar panels that gather photons, energy from the sun, and channel it, convert it into electricity and send it into the space station to be stored in batteries and run the equipment and scientific instruments in there, the oxygen systems and so on. So a lot of very high level technology involved with these operations. 1987, there was a joint statement of cooperation, which laid the groundwork for U.S. Russian Mir and Space Shuttle dockings. Again, a great triumph of international cooperation, not only diplomacy, but technology as well, and making sure that everybody would be able to dock with each other, and all the systems would work together. Very dramatic. U.S. Space Shuttle Mir in orbit in September.
Was a flight where there was a high degree of congressional interest because of the risk. There were questions about the Mir space station having the fire. Previously, they had the collision. And then a couple of days before liftoff, the Mir experienced another attitude control computer failure, and so they lost attitude control. So there were a lot of questions that we had to answer prior to liftoff regarding whether or not it was safe to go up to the Mir.
And there you have it. A lot of the technical difficulties involved. Fortunately, there's never been any major disaster in space. Sadly, of course, in January of '86, NASA lost the Space Shuttle Challenger and the 7 astronauts on board that, including the teacher, Krista McAuliffe, and also Judy Resnick, and the other astronauts, Ellison, Onizuka, and these other astronauts. It was a great tragedy. I'm sure many of you remember that. The result of a frozen O-ring in one of the boosters. Cold front had come in over Cape Canaveral overnight, frozen one of the rings that were supposed to seat and prevent fumes from getting out and causing the destruction of the spacecraft and the whole operation. The International Space Station has been in orbit now since November of 2000. It's traveling at about, like the other spacecraft up there, 17,500 miles an hour, about 200 miles up. Again, you see the light gathering solar panels, which gather light from the sun, power all the instruments on the orbiting space station. And you can see the space station go overhead periodically every month for several days in a row, spaced out. You can go to a website called spotthestation.com, and it's a NASA site, spotthestation.com, where it will tell you when and where you could look for the space station overhead. And it's usually pretty bright and moving along at about the speed of a satellite in orbit. So you might watch out for that. So many Russians, nationalities, U.S. astronauts have been on the space station over the last 20 years. Definitely an international project. Then the Columbia disaster in February of 2003 killed the 7 astronauts on that shuttle mission. The Columbia was re-entering the atmosphere and was over Texas when it disintegrated. Some of the protective panels had been damaged on launch, and when they returned to Earth, those panels heated up the tiles and did not protect. The heat got into the craft and it disintegrated. Another great tragedy and setback for the U.S. space program. It continued flying until about 2011, however, when they finally ended the space program. And after 2011, the U.S., we would send our astronauts over to Russia, to Kazakhstan, and go up in their Soyuz rockets, Soyuz spacecraft on the Vostok. So it was kind of interesting to have U.S. astronauts going up on Russian spacecraft to the International Space Station. But again, that's a great example of the cooperation between the scientific communities, at least, in these two superpowers. Here we see a Russian cosmonaut working in space while they're orbiting Earth in 2012. This is much more recently. January of 2020, U.S. astronaut Christina Koch returned to Earth after 328 days in space, a record for a female in space. And so I'm sure she was glad to get back to Earth after all that time. You have to keep exercising when you're in orbit because when you're in the weightlessness of space, your bones start to deteriorate because you don't need your skeletal system to hold you up from the force of gravity because there's very little to no gravity. And so you have to go through kind of a reconditioning when you return to Earth after a long time in space, as all these astronauts have to do. During that time when U.S. astronauts were going up on the Russian rockets and returning to Earth on the Soyuz spacecraft you see there. They hard land in the Kazakhstan steppes with a parachute. And so here you see literally the U.S. astronauts in the hands of Russian technicians being taken away after returning from the International Space Station. again, you can imagine the force of gravity on your body after you return to Earth is pretty significant. So that's been an issue that NASA and the Russians and everybody has been dealing with and learning to adapt to. So here we see in April of 2020, U.S. and Russian cosmonauts at the International Space Station. But we've entered a new era now as we come to the close of our program and talk about the new era that has been dawning with private commercial spacecraft. SpaceX, which is headed by Elon Musk, they're launching their own rockets in cooperation with NASA from Cape Canaveral. So in May of this year, some of you may have seen the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket with astronauts Robert Behnken and Douglas Hurley on board. They went up to the International Space Station and spent about a month, and then they came back and splashed down in the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of Pensacola and were picked up by ships and brought back to Houston Johnson Space Center. And there they are after their successful mission and launch. Apparently, SpaceX just launched several astronauts just a few days ago as well, successfully. So we've really entered a new era of private space program. There's other ones out there. There's actually launch sites built in South Texas and in West Texas. NASA itself is building a new generation of heavy lift rockets to take astronauts and cosmonauts to the moon and Mars. So we've really entered a whole new era now of space travel with public-private partnerships. The Russians themselves are designing a new space station to be their next generation after the International Space Station outlives its life expectancy. This is the OPSEC space station that Russia is designing and working on launching into orbit. So a lot going on. Recently, the U.S. government with NASA signed what's known as the Artemis Accords, which is basically another generation of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And it pretty much covers the same topics: peaceful uses of space, transparency of operation, interoperability of technology, assist each other if there's a crisis in space, watch out for space debris, and so on. So it's a good accord and provides a structure and a framework for the nations to operate together. So we'll close out here our program today with our thought that we started with, the human desire to reach back out into the heavens from which we came, really. Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, said that our bodies are made of the elements that were forged in stars. So he said that we are made of star stuff. Those of you that watched Carl Sagan's Cosmos series, which you can find on YouTube also. But that old Latin phrase, per aspera ad astra, through hardship to the stars, humans will return to space and the stars and perhaps understand our place in the cosmos. Thanks again for your presence at this program, and all of you there at Luther Crest in Allentown, Pennsylvania. It's been a pleasure and an honor talking to you. It's been quite a year here. I believe you're watching this program tomorrow, which would be Wednesday, December 30th, 2020. I think Brandon will be showing that to you via the YouTube posts. And hope you all have a happy New Year's Eve and a good, healthy new year ahead. So God bless us all and take care. Enjoy your winter, and we'll be in touch again soon for another program. Thanks a lot. Mike Albrecht signing off from Austin, Texas.